What turned the U-boats, once the pride of Nazi Germany's navy, into drifting steel coffins at the bottom of the cold sea? Why did tens of thousands of sailors never return once they boarded these vessels? And what really happened inside those submarines, far beneath the waves? Today, we dive deep into one of the darkest and least told chapters in the history of modern warfare. So fasten your seatbelt as we dive into today's mystery. But first, you might just change your luck if you like and subscribe before this video ends. Throughout the history of modern warfare, few symbols have instilled as much terror as Germany's U-boats. They were ghosts beneath the waves, silent predators that sank over 2,700 Allied ships and claimed the lives of thousands of sailors. But behind those staggering death tolls lies another grim truth. Of the roughly 40,000 crewmen who served aboard U-boats, more than 30,000 never returned. It was a catastrophic casualty rate, surpassing even the bloodiest battlefields on land. Yet before they became the nightmare of the Atlantic, U-boats had remarkably humble beginnings. In 1850, a German engineer named Wilhelm Bauer sketched out the first submarine prototype ever conceived in Germany. During its maiden test, the vessel promptly sank to the bottom of the sea. But that failure didn't deter Bauer. He continued his experiments undaunted. Nearly half a century later, as Europe approached the dawn of the 20th century, Germany began to realize that naval dominance didn't have to rely on massive battleships. As the arms race with Britain drove the cost of warships to unsustainable levels, Germany chose a different path: guerrilla warfare beneath the sea. By the time World War I broke out, Germany had 28 combat-ready U-boats in service. And within just weeks, the U-9 carved its name into history with blood. In less than an hour, it sank 3 British cruisers, killing over 1,400 sailors. In that moment, the world realized that the rules of naval warfare had changed forever. What few people know, however, is that those early U-boats were not true submarines in the modern sense. They functioned mostly as surface vessels, submerging only to attack or evade detection. On the surface, they ran on diesel engines that also recharged their batteries. But once submerged, they depended entirely on a crude electric battery system that made them more vulnerable than ever. At first, U-boat commanders adhered to the established rules of naval engagement, which meant stopping merchant ships and allowing their crews to evacuate before sinking the vessel. But that code of chivalry didn't last. The British soon introduced the tactic of Q-ships, decoy vessels that appeared to be unarmed merchant ships, but concealed heavy artillery, ready to ambush a surfacing U-boat. After a string of deadly encounters in which U-boat commanders were killed in these traps, Germany was forced to change its strategy. What followed was the beginning of unrestricted submarine warfare. Every ship, military or civilian, became a target, and the name U-boat began to strike fear across the world's shipping lanes. If the sinking of 3 British warships by the U-9 was a chilling declaration that a new era had begun at sea, then the attack on the RMS Lucatania was the moment the world realized that no one was safe on the ocean anymore. In May of 1915, Germany's U-20 submarine spotted a massive ship entering waters off the southern coast of Ireland. It was the passenger liner RMS Lucatania, carrying over 1,900 people on board, among them women, children, and American citizens. The Lusitania was considered part of the civilian world, far removed from the battlefield. But at exactly 2:10 in the afternoon, a single torpedo sent the vessel plunging into the depths of the sea. 1,198 lives were lost. Among them were 128 American nationals. To the Germans, it was a strategic strike. They claimed the Lusitania was not entirely innocent, alleging that it may have been carrying weapons and ammunition bound for the Allies. But to global public opinion, especially in the United States, the attack was unforgivable. Photographs of children's bodies washed ashore, stories of passengers clinging desperately to lifeboats in icy waters. These images ignited a firestorm of outrage in the American public. President Woodrow Wilson, who had been steadfast in his efforts to keep the United States out of the war, suddenly found himself in a precarious position. Pressure mounted from both Congress and the American people, demanding a strong response. Germany promised to limit attacks on passenger ships, but that promise would prove fleeting. In truth, the Lusitania incident triggered a series of irreversible shifts. It not only pushed America closer to entering World War I, but also marked the permanent disappearance of the so-called gentleman's rules of naval warfare. What remained after the attack were not lifeboats or floating luggage, but the shattered illusion that war could be restrained by morality and convention. When the guns of the First World War finally fell silent, Europe was left with nothing but ashes and debt. And no name carried heavier weight for Germany than the Treaty of Versailles. It bound the nation in a web of severe military restrictions, forcing it to disarm most of its armed forces and strictly prohibiting the development of submarines. But the Germans, as history has shown time and again, were not a people to kneel so easily. As early as the 1920s, under the guise of legality and with quiet support from neutral countries like the Netherlands and Sweden, German engineers secretly established submarine design offices abroad. They signed shipbuilding contracts with other nations, but the blueprints they created were in fact laying the foundation for a new generation of U-boats. When Hitler came to power in 1933, he officially declared Germany's rearmament, openly rejecting the terms of the Versailles Treaty. And with that declaration, the gates of hell were flung open once more. At the center of that plan stood a new fleet of submarines, leaner, more modern, and deadlier than anything the world had ever seen. Behind this resurrection stood Admiral Karl Dönitz, a former U-boat commander during World War I. Unlike his predecessors, who had been limited by the technology of their time, Dönitz had a strategic vision that was far ahead of his era. Unlike the solo operations of the old U-boats, Dönitz's new Wolfpack model was built on group coordination. Instead of a single submarine stalking a convoy, an entire formation of U-boats would spread out across the ocean and then converge to strike from multiple angles at once, overwhelming the escorts and leaving them helpless. This tactic was not only a leap in military efficiency, but also a psychological weapon that struck fear into Allied crews and decision-makers alike. When war broke out in 1939, it didn't take long for Germany to prove what it was capable of. On the very day that Britain declared war on Germany, U-boat U-30 sank the passenger liner SS Athenia, killing over 100 people. Berlin later claimed it was a technical mistake, but the message was unmistakable. This would not be a war confined to land. It was to be total war, a conflict in which any vessel could become a target, and no one was truly safe. Once again, the world stood on the edge of fear, gripped by the specter of the U-boat. To Nazi Germany, the Atlantic Ocean was not merely a stretch of water, it was a strategic battlefield. By severing the supply lines from North America to Europe, Hitler hoped to cripple Britain's ability to fight. Food, fuel, weapons, tanks, even soldiers, all had to cross a perilous sea, and a single U-boat was all it took to turn a cargo ship into a towering inferno adrift on the waves. When night fell, it was time for the U-boats to strike. Surfacing under the cover of darkness, they moved swiftly across the water, avoiding radar and the watchful eyes of escort ships. Once a convoy was spotted, the entire Wolfpack would shadow it like phantoms. Then, at the perfect moment, the assault would begin. Witnessing such a scene from the deck of a merchant ship must have felt like watching death itself approach. Screams tore through the night, metal groaned, and flames rose into the blackness. From the outside, a U-boat might appear as a marvel of engineering, but inside that steel shell was a world entirely different, a suffocating, dim, and utterly isolated reality. Life aboard a U-boat was a form of torture. In a space barely 50 cubic meters in volume, nearly 50 men lived together. No one had a bed to call their own. Only the captain had a private cabin, and even that space was no larger than a wardrobe. Cramped compartments were wedged between machinery, pipes, torpedoes, and condensation. Every dive sealed them off from the outside world. No sunlight, no fresh air, nothing to remind them they were still alive. The air quality on board was oppressive. After just 24 hours underwater, carbon dioxide levels would rise, causing headaches, fatigue, and nausea. After a few days, the crew would feel as if they were breathing poison. A malfunctioning or outdated battery system could release chlorine or hydrogen gas, turning the vessel's interior into a toxic chamber. A single spark could turn the entire submarine into a self-contained bomb. Fresh water was rationed to just 2 gallons per man per day for drinking, cooking, and hygiene combined. After weeks at sea, skin began to break out in sores and rashes. The stench clung to every surface, every strand of hair, every thread of cloth. But even all of that wasn't the worst part. The most terrifying thing of all was the constant fear, knowing you were living aboard a machine built not only to kill the enemy, but one that could just as easily kill you. When detected, a U-boat would often have to perform an emergency dive to evade attack. Engines were cut, lights extinguished. The vessel slipped into absolute silence. And in that silence, each sailor could hear the ping of enemy sonar echoing through the hull. Some U-boats didn't explode, they simply sank, vanishing quietly to the bottom. And inside them, dozens of men ran out of air, huddled in darkness, waiting for death to come. If there was a single moment in World War II that marked the turning point for Nazi Germany's U-boat force, it was May of 1943, a month so grim that submarine crews came to know it by a haunting name, Black May. In just 31 short days, 43 U-boats were destroyed. That number wasn't just a statistic, it was a clear signal that the golden age of the steel wolves was over. With a loss rate of 41%, the campaign was no longer sustainable by any measure. In the early years of the war, U-boats operated like invisible assassins. They slipped in and out of the vast oceans, wreaking havoc on vulnerable convoys. But by 1943, the game of cat and mouse had flipped. Thanks to technological advancements like radar and sonar, U-boats were being detected far earlier than ever before. Radar, once too bulky to be mounted on aircraft, had been miniaturized and fitted onto long-range patrol planes. Liberators and Catalinas, equipped with U-boat detection gear, turned the night skies into a death zone. On the seas, escort groups had learned not only to protect, but to pursue and destroy. Sonar, underwater listening technology, became the indispensable ears of every destroyer. It not only pinpointed U-boats, but also guided modern anti-submarine weapons directly to them. Hunter-killer groups, task forces created solely to track down U-boats, began sweeping across shipping lanes. What had once been an open ocean for U-boats had now become a massive, death-scented trap. In May of 1943, the U-boat fleet spiraled into a vortex of destruction. Dönitz was forced to issue a temporary withdrawal. From that point on, U-boats were no longer the invisible hunters. They became the hunted, easily detected, and, more often than not, never seen again after being spotted. One little-known truth is that most men who served aboard U-boats were under the age of 25. They were students, mechanics, young men who, after just a few months of training, stepped aboard a submarine and vanished from the surface world. And many of them, more than 30,000, never came back. Today, resting silently at the bottom of the North Sea, the Irish Sea, and throughout the cold waters of the Atlantic, dozens of U-boats remain. They are the sunken relics of a time when the name U-boat inspired dread across the oceans. If today's story made you pause, even for a moment, to reflect on the forgotten fates lying at the bottom of the ocean, don't hesitate to share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you'd like to continue joining us on this journey through untold chapters of history, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We'll see you in the next video.